Jerome Washington's 1957 Detroit Lions cufflinks caught the light as bank manager Richard Caldwell examined his ID with theatrical disgust. "This looks questionable," Caldwell sneered, though the license was clearly valid until 2026. Without warning, he dropped it. The plastic cracked against marble like a gunshot. Jerome stood frozen. 40 years of postal service, a Bronze Star from Vietnam, his son David's billion-dollar company about to sign the biggest tech deal in Detroit history, and this man treated him like trash. The lobby fell silent. Other clients stared. David's jaw clenched, watching his father humiliated at his own moment of triumph. Jerome touched his cufflinks, inherited from his father, who testified before Congress about military discrimination in 1962. Sergeant Major Washington's handwritten note echoed in his memory: "Stand tall no matter who tries to make you small." As Jerome bent to retrieve his ID, Caldwell's voice carried across the marble. "Maybe the check-cashing place on 8 Mile would be more your speed." The reference to Detroit's racial dividing line wasn't accidental. Neither was what happened next. David pulled out his phone, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "Cancel the TechVision deal. All $5 billion. We're done here." Caldwell's face went white. The biggest contract in First National Bank's history had just walked out the door. But Jerome Washington wasn't finished standing tall, not by a long shot. 2 hours earlier, the Maxwell House coffee was still hot when Jerome's vintage radio crackled to life with WCHB's morning show. Detroit's oldest black radio station had been his soundtrack for 30 years, through Dolores's cancer, through David's MIT graduation, through every morning ritual that anchored his world. "Good morning, Detroit. This is your boy Marcus bringing you into another beautiful Tuesday with some Motown magic." Smokey Robinson's voice filled Jerome's ham-tracked kitchen. "You've really got a hold on me," drifted through morning lights streaming across faded linoleum floors that had witnessed 4 decades of family meals, homework sessions, and quiet conversations about navigating a world that didn't always welcome them. Jerome straightened his tie in the hallway mirror, the same mirror where Dolores used to fix his collar before church. 2 years since cancer took her, but her voice still guided his morning preparations. "Baby, those cufflinks make you look like the distinguished gentleman you've always been." The cufflinks. Silver lions on navy blue enamel, a championship gift from teammates to Sergeant Major Washington after Detroit's only title in 1957. His father wore them testifying before Congress. Jerome wore them to David's graduation. Today felt important enough for their weight on his wrists. David's 1987 Oldsmobile rumbled in the driveway, his lucky car for big meetings, despite offers to buy him something newer. The boy who'd built billion-dollar technology from their basement still believed in old Detroit superstitions. "Mornin', OG," David grinned, using their private nickname. At 42, successful beyond Jerome's wildest dreams, but still the kid who'd asked endless questions about fixing carburetors in their garage. "You nervous?" Jerome asked, settling into familiar passenger seat worn smooth by countless father-son conversations. "About the deal? Nah. About Caldwell?" David's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Man's got a reputation." Jerome had heard whispers in the community. Richard Caldwell III, third-generation banker from Grosse Pointe old money. His grandfather profited from redlining that kept black families out of good neighborhoods. His father from white flight that hollowed out Detroit's tax base. Richard himself inherited assumptions about who belonged in boardrooms. "Some people carry their family's baggage," Jerome said carefully. "Doesn't mean we have to carry ours." But Jerome's baggage wasn't shame, it was pride. Vietnamese Bronze Star tucked in his wallet next to Dolores's auto. 35 years of postal service without a single customer complaint. Community volunteer work that never made newspapers but changed lives quietly, consistently. The Renaissance Center rose ahead of them, Detroit's symbol of stubborn determination to rebuild. Jerome remembered when these towers were just hope sketched on architects' plans. Now David's company occupied 3 floors, employing hundreds, transforming citywide infrastructure through smart technology. First National Bank's marble facade spoke of older Detroit power, the kind built on exclusion rather than innovation. Founded 1847, it had weathered economic storms by adapting selectively. Some changes came easily, others required pressure. "You sure you want me in this meeting?" Jerome asked as they parked. David's response came without hesitation. "Dad, you taught me everything about integrity. Today, we signed the biggest deal of my career. Course I want you there." Jerome touched his cufflinks, feeling his father's presence. Sergeant Major Washington had faced down senators who questioned his intelligence, his reliability, his right to speak truth to power. He'd stood tall when others expected him to bow. Today might require the same courage. Walking toward First National's glass doors, Jerome noticed details David missed. How security guards' eyes lingered. How conversations paused as they approached. 40 years of reading these subtle signals had taught him to recognize the difference between professional courtesy and genuine welcome. But success was supposed to change these calculations. David's achievements should have earned them respect automatically. The billion-dollar deal should have guaranteed red carpet treatment. Should have. The cufflinks caught lobby light as they entered, casting tiny reflections across marble that had witnessed a century of Detroit's financial history. Some chapters were written in ink, others in blood. Today would add another page to that ledger. Jerome just didn't know yet whether it would be written in triumph or tears. The crystal chandeliers cast shadows that seemed to follow Jerome across the lobby. He counted 73 minutes of waiting while white clients with later appointments disappeared into conference rooms. David's phone buzzed with increasingly urgent texts from legal teams, board members, media representatives. Everything waited on this handshake. "Mr. Washington?" A tall figure emerged from the executive elevator, moving with the casual arrogance of inherited privilege. Richard Caldwell III looked like Central Casting's version of old money. Silver hair, perfectly styled, suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. His handshake with David was firm, professional. His eyes barely acknowledged Jerome's presence. "Shall we head upstairs?" Caldwell gestured toward the elevator. "Actually," David's voice carried quiet pride, "I'd like you to meet Jerome Washington, my father and company advisor." Something flickered across Caldwell's face, surprise mixed with barely concealed annoyance. Jerome had seen that expression before, when black achievement challenged comfortable assumptions. Of course, family business. The word sounded patronizing, making success seem quaint rather than impressive. Jerome extended his hand. Caldwell's grip was perfunctory, the kind of handshake that fulfilled social obligation without conveying respect. "Before we go up," Caldwell announced loudly enough for the lobby to hear, "I'll need to see some identification, security protocol." David's eyebrows shot up. "ID? For a scheduled meeting?" "Bank policy." Caldwell's smile never wavered. "I'm sure you understand." Jerome understood perfectly. No white client in the lobby had asked for identification. This was theater, designed to establish hierarchy, remind everyone of their place in carefully maintained social order. Without protest, Jerome reached for his wallet. Worn leather, his father's before him, containing driver's license, Bronze Star citation, and that faded photograph of Sergeant Major Washington in dress uniform. The handwritten note tucked behind it. "Stand tall no matter who tries to make you small." Caldwell examined the license with theatrical scrutiny, held it to the light, turned it over multiple times, made a show of comparing photo to Jerome's face. Valid until 2026, photograph clear, information accurate. But accuracy wasn't the point, performance was. "This looks," Caldwell paused for maximum effect, "questionable." The word hit Jerome like a physical blow. 40 years of postal service reduced to questionable. Vietnam Bronze Star dismissed, questionable. His son's billion-dollar success shadowed by his father's questionable credentials. Around the lobby, conversation stopped. Some clients looked away in embarrassment. Others watched with morbid curiosity reserved for public humiliation. Jerome touched his cufflinks, feeling his father's strength flow through silver lions. Sergeant Major Washington had faced down senators who questioned his intelligence, his reliability, his right to speak for his people. He'd stood tall when others expected him to bow. Maybe, Caldwell continued with practiced cruelty, the check-cashing place on 8 Mile would be more your speed. The reference to Detroit's traditional racial dividing line wasn't accidental. Neither was the suggestion that Jerome belonged in payday loan establishments rather than investment banks. David's face transformed. The successful businessman disappeared, replaced by a son watching his father's dignity trampled by institutional arrogance. The same man who'd worked 3 jobs to pay for David's education, who'd never missed a school event despite exhaustion, who'd taught him that success meant lifting others as you climbed, now being told he didn't belong in his own son's moment of triumph. Then Caldwell's fingers loosened. The ID slipped from his grasp, deliberately, theatrically, cruelly. Plastic cracked against marble, like a gunshot.
The lobby fell silent, except for the whisper of climate control and distant elevator hums. Jerome stood perfectly still, the sound of his dropped ID echoing like an accusation. Everyone waited to see how this moment would resolve. Emboldened by the lack of immediate consequences, Caldwell stepped closer. "You know what? Maybe you'd be more comfortable waiting outside while the adults discuss business." The words carried across marble like a slap. Adults. As if Jerome's 42-year-old son was somehow more adult than the man who'd raised him. As if success was measured only by skin color and bank account location. David's voice became steel. "My father built the foundation that made this deal possible. He's staying." But Caldwell doubled down, his smile turning predatory. "Sir, I'm thinking of everyone's comfort level here." Jerome bent slowly to retrieve his identification. As he straightened, something unexpected happened. A young Asian woman in a sharp business suit approached from across the lobby. "Mr. Washington?" Her voice carried quiet authority. "I'm Sarah Chen, and I need to speak with you." Caldwell's confident expression faltered. "Miss Chen, we're in the middle of—" "Actually, Mr. Caldwell," Sarah's interruption was precise, professional. "I'm here for the transition meeting that was scheduled for 11 o'clock. "Transition meeting?" Sarah turned to Jerome with genuine respect. "Mr. Washington, please accept my sincere apology for what just occurred. Your identification is perfectly valid, and you are absolutely welcome in this institution." Jerome studied her face, recognizing something familiar. Not submission to institutional power, but the quiet strength of someone who'd fought their own battles against assumption and prejudice. "Transition meeting," David's business instincts sharpened. Sarah's next words changed everything. "Mr. Caldwell's employment was terminated yesterday following a federal investigation into customer service violations. I'm his replacement as senior relationship manager." The power dynamic shifted like tectonic plates. Caldwell's face went from confident to confused to panicked in the span of 3 seconds. "That's impossible," Caldwell sputtered. "Nobody told me." "The termination letter was hand-delivered to your home address last evening," Sarah replied calmly. "Security will escort you out after you gather your personal items." Jerome felt the cufflinks weight differently now. Not as shields against humiliation, but as witnesses to justice finally served. His father's voice echoed, "Sometimes you're losing the whole game until the final quarter." But Caldwell wasn't finished. Desperation made him reckless. "This is exactly what's wrong with this city," his voice cracked with barely contained fury. "People who don't belong thinking they own the place. My family built this bank when Detroit actually meant something." The mask had finally dropped. Raw prejudice poured out like infection from a lanced wound. Other customers stepped back, some in shock, others in embarrassment. A young black entrepreneur near the information desk spoke up. "I've banked here 15 years and never been treated like that." An elderly white woman added, "That's absolutely disgraceful behavior." Jerome realized this wasn't about one bigoted banker anymore. It was about every institution that allowed such behavior to fester in dark corners, protected by family connections and willful blindness. David pulled out his phone, his decision crystallizing. Cancel the TechVision deal immediately. All $5 billion. Find us new banking partners by tomorrow. "Sir, please wait." Sarah stepped forward, but David's mind was made. "No," David's voice carried across the lobby. "My father served this country in Vietnam, worked 35 years for the Postal Service, built the character that built my company, and your former employee, treated him like garbage." Caldwell's panic turned to pleading. "Mr. Washington, surely we can work something out." But Jerome Washington, touching his father's cufflinks one more time, had made his own decision. "Son," he said quietly, "let's go home. We've got work to do." The biggest deal in First National's history walked out the door, but something bigger was just beginning.
News traveled at digital speed through Detroit's business community. By noon, #DetroitDignity was trending on social media. By 2 o'clock, 3 other minority-owned companies had announced they were reviewing their banking relationships. By evening, First National stock had dropped 12%. Jerome sat in his Hamtramck garage, hands deep in the engine of a 1967 Mustang restoration. The familiar ritual, cleaning spark plugs, checking compression, adjusting carburetors, always helped him think clearly. Today, he needed clarity more than ever. David burst through the side door, phone still pressed to his ear. "Dad, this is exploding. Detroit Free Press wants an interview. Channel 7 sent a camera crew to the office. My phone hasn't stopped ringing." Jerome wiped his hands on an oil-stained rag that had belonged to his father. "What are you telling them?" "The truth, that we walked away from $5 billion because dignity isn't negotiable." Through the small radio on his workbench, WCHB played Aretha Franklin's Respect. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Jerome's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the voice was unmistakable. Thomas Morrison, First National's Senior Executive Vice President. "Mr. Washington, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I was wondering if we might speak privately." 20 minutes later, Morrison sat on a folding chair in Jerome's garage, looking remarkably uncomfortable in his $1,000 suit among the oil stains and chrome bumpers. "I've been at First National for 37 years, Morrison began. "I hired Richard Caldwell despite red flags because his grandfather was my mentor. I've watched this bank protect people like him while failing people like you. Today was my wake-up call." Jerome set down his wrench, really looking at the man for the first time. Morrison's hands shook slightly, not from age, but from the weight of complicity finally acknowledged. "What are you asking me, Mr. Morrison?" "I'm asking for a chance to make this right, not with money or apologies, but with real change. Sarah Chen isn't just Caldwell's replacement, she's leading a complete cultural overhaul. Federal oversight, mandatory training, community advisory boards." David leaned against the Mustang's fender. "And you think that fixes what happened to my father?" No, Morrison's honesty was stark. Nothing fixes humiliation. But maybe it prevents the next father from experiencing what yours did. Jerome touched his cufflinks, thinking of his father's congressional testimony. Sergeant Major Washington hadn't just complained about discrimination, he'd helped write new military integration policies. Personal pain had become institutional progress. "Mr. Morrison," Jerome said slowly, "what happened today wasn't about one bigoted employee. It was about a system that enabled him. If you're serious about change, prove it." Morrison nodded. "What would that look like?"
Jerome glanced at David, seeing his son's approval in his eyes. Community Oversight Board with real power, annual discrimination audits by independent firms, and $10 million in low-interest loans for minority businesses that your bank previously rejected. Done. The speed of Morrison's agreement surprised even Jerome, but then he realized First National was fighting for its survival. Without major institutional clients like TechVision, the bank faced federal takeover or buyout by national chains. David's phone buzzed with a text that made him smile. "Dad, Detroit Community Bank Consortium just offered us better terms than First National ever did. 3 minority-owned banks sharing the deal." Jerome felt something shift in his chest. Not victory exactly, but recognition that standing up had opened doors he hadn't expected. "Mr. Morrison," Jerome said, standing and extending his hand, "First National missed its chance today, but if you're serious about change, the community will be watching." Morrison's handshake was firmer this time, carrying weight of genuine commitment rather than social obligation. After Morrison left, Jerome and David stood together in the garage's golden evening light. The radio played Sam Cooke's "A Change Is Gonna Come," Detroit's eternal anthem of hope and determination. "You realize what just happened, don't you?" David said. Jerome touched his cufflinks one more time. "We stopped accepting the world as it is and started demanding the world as it should be." Outside, Detroit's skyline caught the setting sun, casting long shadows across a city that had always specialized in reinvention. Today had added another chapter to that story, written not in ink or blood, but in the simple courage of a man who decided to stand tall when it mattered most. 3 days later, Detroit Free Press ran the headline, "Vietnam Vet's Dignity Sparks $5 billion Banking Revolution." Jerome's story had caught fire beyond Michigan's borders, becoming a symbol of how economic power could challenge systemic racism. Standing in his garage, Jerome read emails on David's tablet while cleaning carburetors. Messages from Baltimore, Phoenix, Seattle, entrepreneurs sharing their own discrimination stories. Each email carried the same theme: "Your courage gave me permission to fight back." "Dad, look at this," David called from the doorway, holding his phone. "Martha Reeves just posted about you on Instagram. Smokey Robinson wants to meet you. Detroit legend status, man." Jerome smiled but felt the weight of unexpected responsibility. He'd become a symbol, whether he wanted it or not. The garage door rattled open. Sarah Chen stepped inside, no longer the polished banker, but wearing jeans and a University of Michigan sweatshirt. "Mr. Washington, I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I have news." She handed Jerome a thick folder. Federal investigators found patterns at 17 banks nationwide. Your case wasn't isolated, it was systematic. The Department of Justice is launching the largest banking discrimination probe since the Civil Rights era. Jerome touched his cufflinks, feeling his father's presence. Sergeant Major Washington's congressional testimony had helped integrate the military. Now his son's humiliation was exposing financial discrimination coast to coast. "There's more," Sarah continued. 4 banks have already agreed to consent decrees rather than face prosecution. Combined community investment commitments exceed $200 million. David whistled low. $200 million in minority business loans because Dad stood up to one racist banker? "Because your father refused to accept humiliation as the price of doing business," Sarah corrected. Individual courage became collective action. Jerome's phone rang. The caller ID showed congressional area code, Washington, D.C. "Mr. Washington, this is Congresswoman Angela Davis's office. The representative would like to invite you to testify before the House Financial Services Committee about banking discrimination." After hanging up, Jerome stared at the phone in wonder. His father had testified before Congress about military discrimination in 1962. 63 years later, his son would address the same issues in financial services. "Full circle," David said quietly. Jerome nodded, understanding that this moment had been building for 3 generations. Every quiet endurance of prejudice, every time he'd chosen dignity over confrontation, every lesson he'd taught David about character mattering more than comfort. all leading to this, a chance to transform individual pain into institutional change. "When do we leave for Washington?" Jerome asked. Sarah smiled. "Next Tuesday. And Mr. Washington, wear the cufflinks. Let them see what 3 generations of American service looks like." That evening, Jerome sat in his garage workshop, polishing his father's silver lions until they gleamed. Outside, Detroit hummed with evening traffic, a city that had survived economic collapse, racial tension, and municipal bankruptcy through the simple determination of people who refused to quit. Tomorrow, he'd start preparing testimony that might help ensure his granddaughter never faced the humiliation he'd endured. The cufflinks caught the workshop's fluorescent light, casting tiny reflections across tools that had belonged to his father. Lions who'd won only one championship, but never stopped fighting. Sometimes that was enough to change the world.
The House Financial Services Committee hearing room buzzed with tension. C-SPAN cameras captured every angle as Jerome adjusted his father's cufflinks one final time. 3 generations of Washington men had led to this moment. Committee Chairwoman Angela Davis called the session to order. Today, we examine systemic discrimination in American banking through the testimony of Mr. Jerome Washington, whose experience has sparked nationwide reform. Jerome leaned toward the microphone. Behind him sat David, Sarah Chen, and surprisingly, Thomas Morrison, all witnesses to institutional change born from individual courage. "My father, Sergeant Major Washington, wore these cufflinks when he testified here in 1962 about military discrimination." Jerome's voice carried clearly through the chamber. "He taught me that lions don't always win, but they never quit fighting for what's right." Cameras zoomed in on the silver lions as Jerome continued. "When Mr. Caldwell dropped my identification, he thought he was humiliating one old black man. He was actually challenging 3 generations of American service." Republican Congressman Bradley shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Washington, wasn't this simply one employee's poor behavior rather than institutional discrimination?" Jerome had prepared for this question. "Congressman, federal investigators found similar patterns at 17 banks. My experience wasn't unique, it was systematic." Sarah Chen leaned forward at the witness table. "Committee members, I've documented over 200 discrimination cases in 18 months. Mr. Washington's case provided evidence we needed for prosecution." The hearing room stirred. This was bigger than one Detroit bank. Chairwoman Davis addressed Morrison directly. "Mr. Morrison, you enabled Mr. Caldwell for years. Why should Congress trust your bank's reform promises?" Morrison's answer surprised everyone. "Madam Chairwoman, I don't ask for trust. I ask for oversight. My bank should be monitored until we prove change, not promise it." Jerome watched Morrison's transformation with something approaching respect. Accountability required courage, even from those who'd failed before. "Mr. Washington," a Democratic Congresswoman asked, "what would real reform look like?" Jerome touched his cufflinks, channeling his father's clarity. "Federal oversight boards with community representation, annual discrimination audits by independent firms, and criminal penalties for executives who enable discriminatory practices." The room fell silent. Criminal penalties meant real consequences for real people. During the lunch break, Jerome walked the Capitol's marble halls where his father had once testified. Different building, same struggle, but with one crucial difference. This time, the system was listening. Richard Caldwell appeared unexpectedly in the corridor, flanked by his attorney. 6 months of federal investigation had aged him years. His hands shook as he approached. "Mr. Washington, I know my apology means nothing now, but I need to say it anyway. What I did was wrong, inexcusable." Jerome studied the broken man before him. "Mr. Caldwell, apologies don't undo humiliation, but actions can prevent future ones. I'm testifying this afternoon against my former colleagues, against practices I enabled." Caldwell's voice was barely audible. "It won't bring back your dignity, but maybe it'll protect someone else's." Jerome nodded slowly. Even redemption required courage. That evening, as committee members drafted the Washington Banking Equity Act, Jerome sat in his hotel room polishing his father's cufflinks. Tomorrow he'd return to Detroit, but the work would continue. Individual dignity became institutional change. One dropped ID had reshaped American banking. The Lions had finally won their championship.
6 months after the congressional hearing, Jerome stood in the grand lobby of what was now called Detroit Equity Bank. The same marble floors where his ID had been dropped now displayed a bronze plaque. In recognition of Jerome Washington, whose courage sparked institutional change. Sarah Chen, now promoted to Chief Ethics Officer, guided him through the transformation. Gone were the oil paintings of stern founders. In their place hung portraits of Detroit's diverse business leaders, including a photograph of Jerome wearing his father's cufflinks. The Community Oversight Board meets monthly, Sarah explained. Discrimination complaints are investigated within 48 hours, and we funded over 300 minority businesses through the Washington Foundation loans. Jerome smiled at that name. The $10 million Morrison had promised had grown into something larger, a permanent fund ensuring future entrepreneurs wouldn't face the barriers he'd encountered. David approached from the elevator, grinning broadly. "Dad, you ready for this?" Today marked the official signing of TechVision's partnership with the Detroit Community Bank Consortium. The same $5 billion deal that had walked out of First National was finally being completed, but with institutions that reflect Detroit's values rather than its prejudices. At the signing ceremony, Jerome sat between David and his granddaughter Angela, home from college for the occasion. Watching her confident smile reminded him why the fight had mattered. She would grow up in a world where her grandfather's humiliation had paved the way for her opportunity. Morrison approached after the ceremony, looking genuinely transformed. "Mr. Washington, I have something for you." He handed Jerome a leather portfolio. The board voted unanimously. "We're renaming our community investment program the Sergeant Major Washington Financial Justice Initiative." Jerome felt his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. His father's legacy would live on in practical terms: loans, opportunities, futures built on principles the old soldier had died defending. "There's one more thing," Morrison continued. "Richard Caldwell wanted you to have this." Inside the portfolio was a handwritten letter on simple stationery. "Mr. Washington, federal prison gives a man time to think. I've spent 9 months understanding the damage my prejudice caused, not just to you, but to my own soul. Your dignity in the face of my cruelty taught me what character actually looks like. I know I can't undo what I did, but I've established a scholarship fund at Detroit Community College for students pursuing business degrees. It's called the Jerome Washington Second Chance Scholarship. Maybe someone else won't make the mistakes I made. Respectfully, Richard Caldwell III." Jerome read the letter twice, then handed it to David. Redemption, it seemed, required action beyond apology. Even from prison, Caldwell was trying to build rather than destroy. That evening, Jerome sat in his garage with Angela, teaching her to tune a carburetor while WCHB played Stevie Wonder's Higher Ground. 4 generations of Washington hands worked together on the Mustang's engine. "Grandpa," Angela asked, "do you think things will really change?" Jerome touched his cufflinks, feeling the weight of progress measured not in years but in lives transformed. "Baby girl, your great-grandfather fought to integrate the military. I fought to integrate banking. Your job is to make sure the next generation doesn't have to fight the same battles." Outside, Detroit's skyline glowed in evening light, a city reborn through the simple courage of ordinary people refusing to accept injustice as inevitable. The work continued, but today it felt like winning. 5 years later, Jerome Washington stood before a packed auditorium at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. In the display case beside him lay his father's cufflinks, on permanent loan alongside Rosa Parks' bus ticket and Martin Luther King's Nobel Peace Prize. These lions represent something larger than Detroit football, Jerome told the audience of educators, activists, and business leaders. They represent the persistence required to change systems that seem unchangeable. The Washington Banking Equity Act had become federal law, creating oversight mechanisms that prevented discrimination nationwide. Jerome's individual humiliation had generated institutional protections affecting millions of Americans. Angela, now 23 and working for the Federal Reserve's Discrimination Enforcement Division, watched from the front row. The fourth generation of Washington leaders had inherited tools her ancestors could never have imagined. After the ceremony, Jerome walked through the museum's exhibits chronicling his family's century of service. His father's military medals, his own postal service commendations, David's technology innovations, Angela's regulatory work, each generation building on the previous one's foundation. David joined him at the final display, a recreation of the First National Bank lobby with audio from the original incident. Museum visitors could experience the moment that changed American banking forever. "Any regrets, Dad?" David asked. Jerome touched the display case containing his father's cufflinks. Only that it took so long. The museum's guest book contained entries from around the world. A businessman from Tokyo. Dignity transcends culture. A student from Nigeria. One man's courage inspired a continent. A teacher from Detroit. My students learned that standing up matters more than standing out. That afternoon, Jerome returned to his Hamtramck garage, now expanded into the Washington Foundation's headquarters. Young entrepreneurs filled the space where he once restored carburetors alone. Today, they were planning business proposals, reviewing loan applications, creating opportunities that hadn't existed 5 years ago. Sarah Chen, now running the Foundation's national operations, briefed him on their latest impact report. 2,000 businesses funded, 15,000 jobs created, 47 cities with dignity banking programs. Personal courage had become economic empowerment for entire communities. Jerome's phone rang with a familiar international number. The caller spoke accented English. "Mr. Washington, this is Dr. Mandela Foundation in South Africa. We would like to invite you to speak about economic justice at our annual conference." After hanging up, Jerome smiled at the irony. A man who'd spent 68 years avoiding attention now traveled the world sharing lessons learned from one moment of public humiliation. That evening, Jerome sat in his restored 1967 Mustang with Angela, teaching her to drive stick in the empty parking lot behind the foundation. 4 generations of Washington hands had worked on this car's engine. "Grandpa," Angela said, wrestling with the clutch, "what's next?" Jerome watched Detroit's skyline glow in the distance, a city that had taught him that breakdown often preceded breakthrough. "Baby girl, your job is to make sure the next generation doesn't need foundations like ours. Sometimes you fight so your children don't have to." The Mustang purred as Angela finally found the sweet spot between clutch and accelerator. Smooth acceleration after years of patient teaching. Just like justice. Just like change. Just like the long arc of history bending toward dignity. The Lions kept playing. And sometimes that was enough.